Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me on a Saturday evening to learn a little bit about history. I'm just going to put up a slideshow that I have. So as Amrita sort of said, I've been running the Citizens Archive of India for the last 6 years, since 2017. Before we start, a quick shout out to its founder, Mr. Rohan Parikh, who founded it and funded it for the first 5 years and has been kind enough to hand it over to me after and continues to support it. So the Citizens Archive of India, people always ask me what it is that I do, and I say oral historian, and then I get a few puzzle looks. I imagine maybe not on a group that regularly attends Khaki lab talks, or maybe a little more keyed into the heritage space. But for those of you who are sort of freshers to this space, let me explain what the archive is. So what really, it's a digital oral history and material memory archive. To move away from being that technical, very simply, oral history is the recording of history from eyewitnesses. So you talk to the eyewitness of an event a number of years after that event has taken place. I apologize, there is some odd disturbance behind me, just a second. Yeah. And record their memories of it. Now, oral history has been fairly popular in the West for the last many decades, and I'm very glad to say has really been gaining popularity in India over the last few years. You see archives like this all over the place, especially for the event for the partition. There are oral historians all over the country now focusing on the partition. At this point, I would also like to clarify, because of the brilliant job that they've been doing, a lot of people mix us up with the 1947 Partition Archive and the Partition Museum, and a whole lot of others. While we know them and are friends with them and work with them, we are not a Partition Archive. We have been running 3 oral history projects. Our flagship, and the one I'm largely going to focus on today, is called the Generation 1947 Project. And that involves interviewing people, anyone, any ordinary person born or who has lived a significant part of their lives on the subcontinent and was born before the 15th of August, 1947. So here you see 2 pictures of us conducting oral history interviews. That's me with Mr. Ivan Alva, who was born in Bombay in 1939. And the other picture is my colleague, Sangamitra Chatterjee, who actually conducted a Khaki talk a few weeks ago, for those of you who attended. She's our consultant, and she was really interested in the subject of Mrs. Asha Sheth's interview and asked me if she could conduct it. So I'm behind the camera and I took a picture of her conducting the interview. So that's literally how we record them. Oral history interviews used to be recorded using only microphones, sometimes, and earlier, as my professor once told me, only notes. But now we use cameras, and if you see, I use a very small, nondescript camera, so as not to make anyone uncomfortable. There's no lights, it's not a movie scene, it's not a newsroom, it's nothing like that. It's very different from a journalist's interview as well. Similarly, we also collect material memory, which is photographs, documents, letters, so many things. We have passports. We have, and now that I've thought about it, I wish I had included it, an old baby book from, I think, 1903, where a gentleman recorded, you know, that those sort of books you get where you say baby's first tooth and baby's first lock of hair and all of those milestones. So we have one of those from, I think, 1903, if I'm not mistaken, which is a really, really wonderful thing. We got a vaccine certificate, since those seem to be all the rage in the last few years, unfortunately, but I found a vaccine certificate from 1911, which was also, and we posted it on social media a while ago. So we've been collecting all kinds of things. I hope that explains what oral history is. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions after this. But one of the things the team at Khaki asked me to do was talk about the perspective that oral history brings. And I get the question a lot, how do you know it's not biased? How do you know this, that? How does it add value? And to that, I would say, oh, I don't know what's happened. Yeah. Is that it certainly adds nuance to history. In schools, we study, history a certain way from our textbooks. It's all very black and white. So when we study the freedom movement, for instance, which is what we've been focusing on the last few years, we sort of talk about, there's a very black and white history of this Gandhi, Nehru, Jinnah, and then the nation was split. And it is important to focus on that political history. And of course, in school and in college, we are very limited by time and syllabus. So you can't get into the nuance, the nitty-gritty of how people actually lived at that time. And what we realize is that with this generation, the generation born just before independence, we have the last few years to get their stories and to understand how, for me, it's my grandparents' generation. If you're younger, it might be your great-grandparents. If you're older, it might be your parents' generation. But how they experienced a time in history where our country went through so much change, where our country was not the country that we know today, politically, and we decided to record those everyday stories. And not everything we record is a political story. We also record everyday, things about people's social lives, religious life, all kinds of things, family life, what school was like. Some people have told us about the first time they ever used shampoo, the first time they ever used a sanitary napkin, the first time, those kinds of things, their first television, their first radio, all those kinds of things. So I have a couple of stories like that as well. But to showcase how oral history really adds to written history, it adds nuance, it supplements it really well. I'd like to show you this one video that when I took the interview, it really changed my perspective as a student of that political history that we've always learned. Yes?
मोहम्मद अली जिन्ना के पास में ऑटोग्राफ लेने को गया एक दफे। मैं खादी पहनता था उस वक्त पर। तो मैं बड़ी मीटिंग थी, कम से कम 25-50 हजार आदमी मुस्लिम इकट्ठे हुए थे, वो प्रवचन कर रहे थे। और वहाँ तो हम गए, तो मैंने ऑटोग्राफ मांगा। मुझे देखकर जिन्ना साहब ने बोला कि तुम खादी पहना तो गर्म हो गया, तो हमारे ऑटोग्राफ को फेंक दिए से, गेट आउट फ्रॉम हियर। मैं तो घबरा गया, 50 हजार मुस्लिम मारे तो क्या करेंगे। तो हमें किताब लेके भागा। और मुझे मेरे साथ 2 और भी फ्रेंड्स थे। हरिदास लाल जी वॉज MLA ऑफ सिंध, एक भाटिया था मिस्टर करसनदास, उसका लड़का था। तो हम लोग सब आए, पीछे सोचा कि दूसरे दिन उनके घर पे जावे। तो हम जिन्ना साहब के घर पे गए, बहुत प्यार से बुलाए।
आपने खादी पहनी थी?
हाँ, खादी पहनी थी। आओ बेटा आओ। मुझे पब्लिक में तो ऐसा होता है क्या। और वो गुजराती था। हाँ। जिन्ना गुजराती समझता था, फातिमा गुजराती समझती, तो हमारे बहुत बात हुई पीछे कि ऐसा होता है। पर पीछे उसने एप्पल मंगाया, काटा अपने हाथ से, सबको खिलाया, बहुत प्यार से दिया।
So as you see, this shows a side of Muhammad Ali Jinnah that is certainly not written about in our textbooks. And of course not. Nobody's got the time to find these stories and put them in a school textbook. And people also always ask me, how do you know, that someone's not lying? Or it's not. When you're an oral historian, you do have to keep in mind that memory is very fluid. We are talking about events 70 years after they happened. So his story, while it was certainly accurate, there are certain things that as a historian you have to be mindful of. So when he said that there were 25 to 50,000 Muslims, that is highly doubtful. There probably weren't that many. You have to keep in mind that he was also a child, and it probably felt that way. There was a crowd of Muslims coming to listen to Jinnah speak. And Jinnah had to be, Jinnah the politician was a certain way, but also in private he was a certain way. And we forget that he lived in Bombay. This incident took place in Karachi, by the way, but we forget that he lived in Bombay. He was a very, he was well respected. This man had literally gone to get his autograph just as he would have got Gandhi's. He did have incidents of meeting all the other sort of freedom fighters we know as well. Just as he might have gone to get Mahatma Gandhi's or Nehru's, similarly, he went to get Jinnah's autograph. So I think it's important to remember that history is not necessarily as black and white as we study it. There are personal perspectives, and that brings out a lot of detail. And I think that's vital in sort of learning history. Moving on. Now I'm going to talk about some fun stories about experiencing the birth of the nation. We've recently completed 75 years of independence. Last year, we had a small exhibition to celebrate that. So I've got some of my favorite stories about the freedom movement and about independence itself. So this one is again a video. There's 5 videos through this, so bear with me while we go between the two. Give me a second. This is the story that took place during the Quit India movement in Bombay. This gentleman, Mr. Chaturvedi, Dr. Chaturvedi, I should say, he was a Ved. He lived in Bombay during the Quit India movement and then happened to go to college in Lahore during 47 and then moved back to Bharatpur. So he had a whole lot of stories. I picked his story of living in Bombay during the Quit India movement.
काफी लोग जाते सब जो संस्कृत पढ़ते थे
जी
एक से हमारे कॉलेज के हॉस्टल में काफी लोग जाते सब जो संस्कृत पढ़ते थे
जी
एक सज्जन और थे मेरे ख्याल में उनका नाम सरनेम मेहता था लेकिन उनके मैं भूल रहा हूँ नाम हम तो बच्चे थे 14 वर्ष के लेकिन वो एजड थे और संस्कृत पढ़ते थे वो हमसे बहुत सीनियर कक्षाओं में थे और मेरे ख्याल में उनकी आयु 25-30 के करीब होगी वो पक्के कांग्रेसी थे वही सज्जन ने हमसे कहा कि सिनेमा देखते हो मैंने कहा भाई हमें कोई खास शौक तो नहीं है क्योंकि अपने पास पैसे वैसे नहीं है पहले सबसे नीचे वाला 4 आने का होता था फिर 9 आने का होता था फिर 14 आने 4 आने पैसे भी कहाँ से लाएं बोले कि हम आपको एक टिकट देंगे और वो टिकट थैला लेके जाना वहाँ पे बगल में कोई आदमी आएगा जब अंधेरा हो जाएगा आएगा वो तुम्हारे पैर के ऊपर वो करेगा तो उसको वो दे देना और वो बाद में वो चला जाएगा अंधेरे में चला जाएगा समझे कि नहीं तो तुमको उससे बात नहीं करनी है कुछ करना नहीं है उसकी तरफ देखना भी नहीं है समझे कि नहीं बस खाली वो तुम्हें नीचे पैर से करेगा और तुम अपना ये थैला यदि उधर की तरफ है तो इधर कर देना इधर की तरफ वो यदि उधर आएगा तो उधर कर देना ठीक तो हमको याद है 14 आने का टिकट और हम 4 आने में बैठने वाले आदमी 9 आने में बैठने तो बड़ी बात थी 14 आने का जो पीछे की तरफ सबसे पीछे होता है ऊपर बालकनी और ये इंपीरियल सिनेमा है अभी भी है
जी
हाथी वाला सिनेमा बोलते हैं लेमिंगटन रोड पर बहुत पुराना है खटारा जैसा अभी भी पड़ा हुआ है उसका टिकट आता था उसमें क्या था उस इंपीरियल सिनेमा में कि उसके 2 रास्ते थे एक मेन एंट्रेंस इधर से था एक पीछे की तरफ से वो गली है हाथी वाला गेट सा तो वो भी लोग जब पिक्चर खत्म होता था तो उसको खोल तो वहां से निकलने की सुविधा रहती थी जो आदमी आता था वो तो हमको 14 आने का टिकट मिलता था हम वहाँ पर आते सिनेमा देखते थे वो कोई आता था हमें नहीं मालूम हम आपको बताएं क्योंकि हमको ये कहा गया कि तुमको उधर बार बार उसकी तरफ देखना नहीं है कौन है क्या समझे कि नहीं तुम अपना पिक्चर देखते रहो समझे कि नहीं हमने कहा ठीक है
So that's the story of Dr. Suresh Chaturvedi. He was about 14 years old when this took place. And he just, all he wanted to do was watch a movie with a 14 Anna ticket, which he just couldn't afford. And unknowingly, he did, he passed messages on, did this almost spy work at, again, I'm sure lots of Bombay fans here, given that it's a Khaki talk, at Imperial Cinema, which, the Hathi Wala cinema, as he said. And I love that story. And he had a few more like this. And he didn't realize till later what it was he was doing. He only realized in hindsight what he was doing. As a child, he didn't really know. So, this is now one of my favorites. We forget very easily that World War II was also going on. There was a different kind of freedom movement playing out. And in fact, we did assist the British war effort. This is the story of Rama Khandwala, and this is one of the most incredible pictures, I think, in the archive. And we've got about 5,000 odd strong material collection now. She was that time Lieutenant Rama Mehta of, the Rani Jhansi Regiment of the Azad Hind Fauj, the Indian National Army. And she grew up, she was the granddaughter of Pranjivan Jagjivan Mehta, who was a jeweler and a close associate of Gandhi. So she grew up in a very luxurious lifestyle as the granddaughter of a jeweler. She grew up seeing freedom fighters like Gandhiji himself go in and out of her house. But they did become, and the family did become followers of Bose and his ideology when Burma, they lived in Rangoon, Yangon, when Burma was bombed by the Japanese. And her mother became a recruiter. And guess who her first two recruits were? It was her and her older sister. And so she says, when Netaji started the Indian National Army, my mother became a recruiter for them. My sister and I were immediately sent to be trained in the Rani Jhansi regiment without completing high school. I was 16 years old, only 16. At first, it was terrible. We had been brought up in such luxury. All of a sudden, we were put into this, and it was so rough and tough. But she was incredible. And again, I think the team at Khaki would like to know, she passed away the end of 2021, if I'm not mistaken. She was considered Bombay's oldest tour guide. She continued doing guided walks around Bombay till she was 91 years old, full time. And then I interviewed her when she was about 92, and she said, now I've become old, so now I only do part-time and I'll retire now. I think I'm getting too old to do this. And 2 years later, she passed away. She does always, she had the most incredible attitude. She stopped going to high school. For the little while she was in high school, the schools changed to Japanese medium. From British schools, they became Japanese schools. She learned how to speak and read and write Japanese. And she sees that as something that, while it was terrifying and terrible at the time, that held her in good stead, because when Japanese diplomats and dignitaries came to Bombay, she was usually picked to show them around. When a film crew came to Bombay, she was picked to show them around. And she says, she talks about a time where she broke her leg in a bombing during the World War. She saw frontline action because she volunteered to go as a nurse, which is the only way women could go to the front itself. And she volunteered to be a nurse. And she said, I broke my leg and I was so demoralized because I was just a teenager in a war zone. And there was no proper medicine and things like that in Memyo in Burma. And I was holed up in bed for 2 months waiting for this leg to heal. And I was crying, and Netaji himself came to my bedside and said, Nahi, rona nahi hai, piche murke nahi dekhna hai, aage badhna hai. And she said, I've always lived my life with that. She came to our exhibition a few years ago and she gave us a short clip. She said, I always say, aage badho, hame itna kaam karna hai abhi for the nation. So that is Rama Khandwala, who was Lieutenant Rama Mehta. This photograph is incredible because when I saw it, it never gets old. I've been doing it for years. I've been dealing with historical artifacts for longer than I've sort of just dealt with them at the archive. But that feeling of touching a piece of history, I can't tell you, it never gets old. It really gives you goosebumps every time. And I see some archivist friends on here who will agree with me. But I asked her, I said, Auntie, and we do a lot of uncle and auntie, we're very casual with our interviewees so that they feel comfortable with us. I said, why are you wearing a ghagra choli? And she said, actually, the need of the hour was to train, to fight as fast as possible. And our uniforms were being stitched at the time. So we wore our ordinary clothes till our uniforms could get stitched. And then she has lovely pictures of herself and her mother and sister in uniform. So that's World War II. There's so many more stories. We've got the naval mutiny. We've got that whole 40s period. Okay, this is again, especially for Khaki, because they asked me to include some built heritage. And I think they'll recognize all these buildings. Everybody, when we ask them about Independence Day itself, especially in Bombay, and of course, we've done interviews in other cities as well, talk about all the monuments being lit up. And so I have 6 of Bombay's most beautiful, the Rajabai Tower, the BMC building, Eros Cinema, the Western Railway building, Oriental buildings. That fountain is the bottom one in the center, and VT station, which is a little out of focus, but what a great photograph anyway. This is not a photographs taken in 1947. They are taken in the 50s sometime. I don't remember the exact year, by one of our interviewees' older brothers. But every year, the city would be lit up like this on Independence Day. And how I wish we still did it this way. It just looks really beautiful here. Now we've got multicolored lights around. So since last Republic Day. And this just looks so lovely. And I had to include it because, and they said, just include something on built heritage. We have a whole lot, but I thought these photos were really special. So this is what Independence Day would have looked like. This is a lovely story, and it really resonates in this day and age where we've had refugee crisis after refugee crisis after refugee crisis in the last few years, whether it's with, the wars in the Middle East, ISIS, now Russia and Ukraine, you name it. And people see refugees either with pity or with disdain. And I think this interview, and it's one of my favorite interviews with this lady, Mrs. Sandhya Janwarkar, and we did 7 sessions of interviews with her. And she said this about her neighborhood, which was Ville Parla in Bombay again, and the refugees, the Sindhi refugees that came in. And she said, suddenly at one point, we began to have hordes of people dressed in this typical Multani dress, walking down the road in front of our house. And they were carrying cloth bags with food or clothes over their head. And we were told that they are coming because of the partition. Remember, most people we interviewed were children at this time and didn't necessarily understand these political concepts. They are all Sindhi refugees and they have come to Mumbai to find a place to live. They were very resourceful. They quickly made themselves at home. We found that they integrated with the community very fast. Now, this I love. It is because of the Sindhis that we have learned to eat outside. Going out to the chaatwalas or going for bhel puri, going down the street and picking up something from the roadside vendor was completely unheard of before 1947. Completely unheard of. You ate at home, period. And the Sindhis came, after the Sindhis came, they introduced this new way of life to Mumbaikars. They introduced that to us. So that was our experience with the Sindhis, a very good experience. I love that. Was it absolutely the first time that people were eaten on the street? Again, probably not. But was that the experience for Mrs. Janwarkar? Yes. And a lot of people of this generation say that our parents simply never allowed us to eat out because of religious constraints or whatever it was. It was not really the done thing. But now when we think about Bombay, especially Bombay or Delhi, you can't think about it without its street food. That street food culture is so important to any Mumbaikar's identity. And I love it. There's a massive, the biggest refugee crisis ever. It was, the partition, and she's just seen the positive in it. And she continued to describe the Sindhis that moved into her building and what a great time they had and how glad she was that they mingled with our society. Remember, this is a group of people who entirely lost their homeland. The Punjabis still got a part of theirs and the Bengalis still got a part of theirs. But the Sindhis came here and she saw it as a very positive experience as someone living in a city who took in these refugees. And I just love that about this story. All right. This is another video. It is the sweetest video. When we did this exhibition last year for 75 years of independence, we realized that this generation also, for the first time, got a lot of personal freedoms that our generation today takes for granted. So whether it's women going to school easily, and when I say women, I imagine that's everyone on this call. I am very aware of the fact that there are a lot of girls across the nation who still, education is still considered a taboo for them. And hopefully we're fighting to change that. But, and all kinds of other freedoms. And there are certain freedoms we take for granted that this generation actually fought for. And I have so many stories and I've struggled to pick one, but I'm going to show you this very sweet video of Mrs. Ravi Prabha Burman and this one freedom she got.
एक चाचा जी थे, वो कांग्रेस में चले गए थे, हमारे ससुर जी से छोटे, तो वो वहाँ के कांग्रेस कमेटी के वो सेक्रेटरी थे, जो भी थे, तो वो आधुनिक विचारों के थे। तो उन्होंने पहली पहल घर का पर्दा, और घर में पर्दा बहुत था हमारे यहाँ, तो जो नौकरों से बात नहीं कर सकते थे, मुंह ढाँक के रहते थे, मुंह ढाँक के बात करेंगे, इतना पर्दा था ना पुराना जी। हमारी जो दादी सासू थी वो नहाने गंगा जी जाती थी, लेकिन बाहर निकल के नहाती नहीं थी, पालकी में जाती थी। और पालकी जो 2 आदमी इधर और 2 आदमी, पाल के समय तो गंगा जी में डुबा दिया जाता था उन्हें। उनका पैर का नाखून भी कहे किसी ने नहीं देखा, तो इतना पर्दा था। तो हम भी जब गए तो हम लोग ऐसे साड़ी पहन के बाहर नहीं निकल पाते थे, ऊपर से चद्दर भी ओढ़ते थे। तो पहली बार चाचा जी ने अनाउंस किया घर में कि ये 15 अगस्त का जब ये फंक्शन है तो आज घर की बहुएं जाएंगी, कोई चादर नहीं ओढ़ेगी। और इतना रोमांच होता था, इतना सुन के रोमांच होता था। आज़ादी, नेहरू जी बोल रहे हैं अब रात 12 बजे हमें आज़ादी मिलेगी, और उनके वो रेडियो में सुनते थे। जो उस दिन बिना पर्दे से, उस दिन से पर्दा हटा हमारे यहाँ। एक
So that is the experience of Mrs. Burman. She lived in Calcutta. She was already married at the time of independence. And she lived in Calcutta. She grew up in Mathura and lived in Calcutta. She was one of the women who had to fight to be educated as well. And I thought, what a lovely story. Not only was 15th August for her and the women of her family, her in-laws' family, freedom from, the British rule, but also freedom from having to veil. I can imagine how hot and humid in Calcutta, it must have been, just with both a sari and a chaddar over one's head. And I thought, what a sweet story. But the thing that she described about kitna romanch hota tha, Nehru ji bol rahe hain, that is what everyone says when we ask them about 15th August 1947. And a lot of them say, you don't know that feeling. You don't know what we felt. There's no way I can describe it to you. I don't have the words. And that in itself usually tends to say enough, because we have so many people who also talk about how the maps that they grew up drawing, which included the entire subcontinent as India, it included Pakistan, it included Bangladesh. They would have to draw Burma. And we had a gentleman say कि हमें आजादी जैसे भी मिली थी, बंटवारे के साथ, with the partition, वो मंजूर थी. We wanted our independence anyhow. But whenever I see a map of India, I can't reconcile my mind with the fact that it is so different from the map that I learned to draw in school. But still, I cannot describe to you the feeling we felt when independence took place. And a lot of people say that, and I think that's such a lovely feeling. It's so lovely to hear, even though I'm sure we can't understand it. Okay, a lot of people also ask me what happens when you have to ask difficult questions. And for the first time, I decided to include a few difficult questions in a talk. We do ask them. A good oral historian goes into an interview without and leaves their bias at the door. I may have certain political views, certain religious opinions, social opinions. I am not to take those into an interview. We only get such a nuanced history if you're open to everyone's perspective. And I will say, doing this for 6 years has really opened up my perspective as well. We do ask difficult questions about societal issues that we know plagued our country then and plague it even now. So here are 3 examples of the things we've asked. There's one more video about, we talk a lot about caste. And in one of our projects, which is the Khaki project that takes place in Delhi, there was certainly that caste system was in place, because it is a village in the heart, by the way, of South Delhi. I'll talk about it more a little later. But my partner who does interviews there, she is from that village, and she wanted to record the oral history project, the oral history of that village. And she said, and I said, look, can you ask people who are considered to be from a lower caste, can you ask them what their experience was then, if it's changed now? And she said, I really want to ask it, but you have to understand that the people I'm asking, my grandfather would have been one of those people who spurned them. And they can't understand why I want to go into their house and have a cup of tea. So these are really difficult questions to ask. You do have to be part of a community to ask them, and it takes a long time of making them comfortable with you. And if they simply refuse to give the answer, as good oral historians, we certainly don't push it. We let them sometimes have a cry about it. Sometimes we let them redact it. We completely respect their wishes. I am going to share a story about the caste system, which really, it hit us hard. Take a look. This is Mrs. Asha Patravali, and she talks about her father-in-law. Yeah.
My father-in-law, he was in 1941 in Dharwad as the principal of Karnataka College. He taught mathematics there. And Ambedkar came to Dharwad. So when he found out that somebody from Cambridge is here. He called up my father-in-law and says, Mr. Patravali, can I come and say hello to you? I'm in Bharat. So my father-in-law was fascinated that Ambedkar is coming to my house. So he came. And after conversation, my father-in-law went towards the kitchen, went to the kitchen and told his wife and mother, send a cup of tea outside, 2 cups. My father-in-law said he waited and waited, and tea never came. Because my father-in-law's mother knew who is Ambedkar, and she refused to give a cup of tea. Ambedkar looked at the pitiful, pathetic sight in my father-in-law's eyes and said, Shrikant, I will leave. And while narrating the story, my father-in-law had tears in his eyes.
But that's the story of, this is after independence. This is after Dr. Ambedkar had become known for all his achievements. And remember, against all odds, the constitution had been written and was in place. And her father-in-law was a Cambridge-educated mathematician and who was fascinated to meet Dr. Ambedkar, as any academic or anyone of us, I'm sure, would be. But for his mother and his wife, that caste prejudice never went away. The next story was about, this is the Hindu-Muslim riots that took place in Bombay during the partition of the country. I asked Mr. Mohsin Contractor, who lived in a chawl that largely consisted of the Buri community, what his experience was. He cried for about 10 minutes, I think. I was sitting in his office and he cried for about 10 minutes before being able to give me the answer. And I told him he doesn't have to give me the answer if he doesn't want. And he said, no, I will. And he recounted one of the most horrific stories I've heard, which is this. I saw nearly 7 people being killed in the riots. The fury was so bad that the stabbing would continue till the man is dead. We lived in an open chawl. So my grandmother told 8 or 9 Hindus to hide themselves in the water tanks. We were all told to go and hide above. She said, I will remain the only person here. If they want to come and open the doors, I will open them. And they will first kill me. And after seeing my blood, they will most probably get pacified. So you will be safe. Very strong person. And a lot of people who experienced the riots at that time talk about the personal strength and friendship between Hindus and Muslims, and always talk about the people who came, the mobs who came were always mobs of strangers. It was our Hindu neighbors or it was our Muslim neighbors who saved us. So this is Mr. Contractor telling us the story of his grandmother. And it was a longer, I've really shortened it here. And he said that, I can't forget that sight of watching people be stabbed. And we hid in the water tanks on the terrace inside them. And my grandmother just said, their bloodlust, it's just bloodlust. It will be satisfied if they kill me. And I have lived my life. I'm old. Y'all are young. They would have been teenagers at this time. I think he would have been 19, if I remember correctly, in 47. And so they hid. And he said, and a lot of people say that sight I will never forget it. I will never forget it. So one more of Mrs. Padma Chopra, and she talked to us about dowry deaths. She says, my sister's daughter was burnt because of dowry. She lived in my neighborhood. She came to my house early in the morning and told my sister that she doesn't want to stay there because she was being harassed every day in that house. My sister told her to go back to her house because, log kya kahenge. After 1 hour, some children came running to me, asking me to come fast. She has been burnt. She is on the roof and it is on fire. So, like I said, these are difficult stories. And it took us a while to learn how to ask interviewees about these incidents in their lives as well. And so long as you do it with sensitivity and don't push for the story, and, we warn them by asking you something a little personal, would you mind answering? And give them space to cry. And it's, and keep those moments personal. If you notice, I haven't put up video clips of these because that's not fair to the person. It's very personal. But we're very aware, and we tell them, you're recording this for a public record, and they say, no, usually they say it absolutely must be recorded. This is the story. This is what we went through. It should be known. So, that's how we deal with it. So we don't shy away from asking the tough questions, because it's this is also a part of our history, and we must know that things like this happened and when people personally experienced it, what they went through. All right, we're going to move to something a little happier, about a new India, and India just receiving its independence, and some of my favorite extraordinary stories, which I love and would just show through the most amazing things. This I like to think of in my head as the country's first ever prank call. Of course, I don't know if it is that, but it seems to be a good guess. And this is Mr. Nandkishore Nautiyal, who lived in Garhwal at the time, and said, my father worked in a flour mill where I remember they had a black box, some kind of a telephone. We found Nehruji's number and dialed it. He answered the call and said, Jawaharlal speaking. I immediately dropped the phone. This was Jawaharlal Nehru. And a lot of people at that time talk about, I mean, he literally said, that there were no numbers to call. We just wanted to try this. So when we looked up numbers, the prime minister's number was the one that we found because he had a telephone. And he answered his own phone. There was no one there to answer it. A lot of people, I'll show you a picture of the first Republic Day parade as well. They talk about, the lack of security. Today, of course, our politicians need the kind of security that they have. The world is a much more dangerous place, unfortunately. But at that time, they said that these people were very approachable because they weren't surrounded by bodyguards, and we had a lot of people who lived in Delhi who said, oh, I'd live here, and Dr. Rajendra Prasad on his way home would pass by on his evening walk, whatever, and we'd wave out every day, and every day he'd wave back and things like that. He was just there in open carriage. And I love those stories. This is a really fun, in fact, let me skip ahead to this and we'll go back to that. This is the first Republic Day parade. The quote is by Sevantilal Parekh. He talks about the first Republic Day experience in Bombay. And he says, I remember the first Republic Day. I wish I could have shown you the video clip. It's up on our social media, and the way he describes it, he's a very good storyteller, and the way he describes it was just wonderful. I remember the first Republic Day. We went out. I had at that time a convertible Buick, which he informed me he fudged his birth date so he could get a driver's license earlier than was legal. I remember having driven from here, and there were lights and all of that. We took the car to Kalba Devi. From here, he lived at Marine Drive. He still lives at Marine Drive. People were throwing flowers which fell into our open car. They were throwing flowers and clapping and all kinds of things. At that time, we felt like we had conquered the world. And I wish I could have shown you the video clip of him saying that sentence, we had conquered the world, and the gleam in his eye when he said it. The picture next to it is, of course, not of the Republic Day in Bombay. It is of the first ever Republic Day parade in Delhi. That is Dr. Rajendra Prasad's carriage. And this man, who was a young child at the time, took his own camera and took a photograph. And he was the one who told me, he said, see, we're just standing there behind a rope, and you can see sort of one policeman in the picture and Dr. Rajendra Prasad in an open carriage. And because they didn't need that kind of security. Usually they had one pilot scooter and that was it. And you'd see them roaming around Delhi. But I love that someone as a child has taken this photograph of the Republic Day parade. You can see the shadow of all the onlookers. And yeah, I love it. It's just that excitement of a new nation in India becoming a republic. You can almost feel it. Okay, I'll go back to the one I skipped. So this is a really funny picture. This is all about sort of discovering fun things in people's homes. And you'll find a lot of things in our archive that you won't find unless the person is well known or has a history that they've written about or recorded somewhere. You won't find in any other public archives because we literally go from house to house searching for these things. And we went through, this is a photograph of a woman called, who was given to me by a woman called Mrs. Lata Sampat. And we went through her whole wedding album because they had every ceremony recorded, ceremony by ceremony by ceremony, and she could explain the significance of everything they did. And I think by the time we finished taking the notes of all of this and things, we had interviewed her, then we took her photographs, and we were tired. And on the last page, there was this photograph of this bus, and I just kind of closed the album saying, oh, whatever, there's a photograph of a bus. And my colleague said, no, open it back up. There's a bus. It's on 2 boats. Didn't you see? And I really hadn't noticed, which is very bad of me as a historian. I should have noticed that. And I said, what? And she said, yeah, just ask her why. And it's a bus on a sort of wooden plank on 2 boats. And I asked her why. She is from a place called Kumta in Karnataka. And she said, when I got married, my in-laws all came here. The wedding took place in Kumta. And the day after the wedding, my husband and his family wanted to go see the famous Jog Falls. So they wanted to do their day of tourism. So we hired them this bus so they could go see it. And the bus to go from Kumta to the Jog Falls had to cross the Sharavati River. Now, the Konkan Railway hadn't been built past there at that time. And so there were no bridges across the river. And so to take a bus across, all of the people had to get off the bus. And the bus had to be driven onto these two rowboats using these planks. And the people were all put into a third boat and you'd row across and then the bus would be driven off again. And the people would get off and get back on the bus and they'd be on their way. And this is how you cross the river. And we've had a lot of people tell us, we had someone who worked in public works and with the hydroelectric projects and things at that time. And this lady, her father worked with them. She said, we had to drive all over the country and you don't understand the country we were given by the British. Everyone says, oh, the British built the railways and this and that. All that is very well, but we were still a country with very little infrastructure. And we had a lot of work to do. So it shows, honestly, it shows how far we've come in 75 years, from having no bridges and, things like that to just where we are today. And I think that's something to be really proud of because that's an achievement that we've done on our own. So sure, the British may have built the railways, but we seem to have done everything else. So that's how I like to think of it. Moving on, I'm a little aware of the time. I'm almost done. I love this. Oral histories feed into many aspects of history, things like marketing history, industrial, business history. Oral history is very important to all of them. And I interviewed Mr. Rajnikant Shah, and he showed me these wedding pictures. They were teeny tiny photos like that. They're really blown up over here of him and his wife who's looking exhausted and his eyes lit up and he told me, he said, we're drinking Gold Spot. That's Gold Spot in our hands. Do you know what a big deal it was to have Gold Spot? You would only get Gold Spot and regular club soda back then. And he told us, apparently if you had Gold Spot at your wedding, you were one of the cool kids. Like, wow, you managed to get Gold Spot and all. It was a really big deal. Says, this is us after our wedding ceremony. It was tiring and all we wanted was to sit and sip a drink. Anyone on this group who has had a wedding reception, has been a bride or a groom at a wedding reception, at their own wedding reception, knows this feeling. All you want is a plate of that food that you have gone and ordered. You want to just taste it at the end of the day. You want a sip of water and nothing else. You want to sit down. And you can see how tired his poor bride is, Mrs. Rasila Shah. And it's so great. And especially weddings, their wedding took place in the 60s, but weddings that took place in the 40s and stuff at the time of rationing, they have some really incredible stories, how they wouldn't even serve custard for dessert and they serve milk and things like that because the rules. This I love. Khaki used it in their teaser in the run-up to this talk. So these days, I found in the last year or two, Mughal-e-Azam tickets from the 1960s are really doing the rounds on WhatsApp and the internet and all of that. But everyone we went to, and especially it started actually with Mr. Rajnikant Shah, who you saw in the previous picture, who was having Gold Spot. Everyone said, when you asked them, tell us about the movies, how do you go to the movies? What are your entertainments? They said, Mughal-e-Azam, when it came out and the hype and the lines to get these tickets. And so many people told us, I still have that ticket somewhere. I said, okay, great, take it out. We want to scan it. And gosh, no one could find it. And I had told my colleague, I said, I'm determined to find a Mughal-e-Azam ticket. And after, I think, 3 years of doing this work, we found one finally in Mr. Muhammad Anis Sheikh's shop. He's a surma wala. He's passed away as well. A surma wala in the back room of a shop in Paidhuni. He said, I have this Mughal-e-Azam ticket. And I was like, finally, it felt like a real victory moment. The joy of that discovery. I can't explain the feeling when you finally find something you've been looking for. And he said it was so popular, log to aadha tola sona dene ko taiyar the, ek ticket, premiere ke ticket ke liye, and things like that. And I love it. I just love old movie tickets and posters and things. It's so much, there's one thing about political history and meeting, Gandhi ji and meeting Subhash Chandra Bose and all these people is always fascinating. But when you get these small nuggets, or, it brings out the film buff in you, or it brings out, it's just, like I said, in this talk, we said it's about making history. I hope to make history relatable. And I think we can all remember the excitement. Now everything's on OTT and watch when you want. But that excitement of one big movie coming out and getting the tickets and going for it. Okay, the last thing, I promise I'll be done in 2 minutes. I think I'm a little over my time. Is Khaki also asked me to talk about intangible heritage. And I must say that oral history is invaluable in recording intangible heritage. Again, for those on this talk who may not know what that is the heritage of things like dance, music, theater, folk tales. That's all intangible, you know, things that are not big forts and buildings. Both are equally important. We record a lot of intangible heritage. I have two stories. I may just skip one from Khaki village, which is our Delhi Ki Khirki project. I must say that, you know, I think I mentioned at the beginning, we also work in partnership with independent oral historians. So Delhi Ki Khirki is a project run by my colleague Ekta Chauhan. She came to us and she said, I'm from Khirki village and I'd like to record its oral history because all the members of the village in the heart of South Delhi next to Saket Mall, they believe that they are descended from the same person, and the village is between 700 and 1,000 years old. I'm not too sure of the exact date. And Ekta's been recording the stories and we've been archiving them so that they become easily searchable because she wants them to be publicly accessible. So I'm going to skip this rather long story, but I'm going to go on to the second one. Again, the photograph is from someone else, but Mr. Srichand Chauhan of Khirki village told Ekta before 1962. Now in 1962, Khirki village, which is at the heart, you know, right next to where Select City Walk Mall is, for those of you who know Delhi, and the Saket Court, and there's a hospital there and things like that. There were fields, there were sugarcane fields everywhere. And he said that before 1962, my father used to bring the Ram Leela here from Mathura. The place where the third house is, that was our Baithak. In front, the takht was set up for the Ram Leela and the audience used to sit in the lane. At night, it was decided who would cook food for the Ram Leela actors the next day. In the morning, the actors got dressed as Ram, Lakshman, and Sita. The people of the village used to carry them on their backs to their respective homes to eat. Bhajans with stories of kings were sung. In between, there were raginis. There were 5 performances of the sang. Sang is a kind of Haryanvi folk theatre, for which 5 to 9 takhts were laid in the middle and people sat around to listen. In the sang, there are also stories of kings and queens. The men played the women's parts. There was no television then. As the popularity of television grew, these performances stopped. On the left is a picture of the Ram Leela given to us by an eminent Bombay historian, actually, Mr. Veer Chand Dharamsi. And it is of a Ram Leela that takes place in Delhi. We have a couple of photographs of the Ram Leela in Khirki, but from much more modern times. So I thought, and we recently posted it. So I thought I'd post a different picture. But this is what intangible heritage, that culture of doing a Ram Leela. In the previous slide, we talk about how Khirki grew this sugar cane and how the sugar cane was processed, and how the sugar cane of Khirki, the good of Khirki, is famous for 100 to 150 kilometers around because of their process. They used the juice of the okra plant to purify, to separate the sugarcane juice from the impurities and make good. Others use chemicals. And so if you ate too much of the other good, you'd get diarrhea. But with Khirki's good, which is famous, so famous that Jawaharlal Nehru actually asked for their sugarcane once and they sent it to him and he couldn't have that good manufactured. So they manufactured some good for him and sent it back to him. You know, and their good wouldn't make you sick because it used natural organic processes. So the documentation of that process also is intangible heritage. Last, I am going to play a video of 2 songs. We record a lot of songs, recipes, things like that. Maybe I'll stop at the second song, Suki, if you tell me you need me to stop. But there's one. This is a song from the freedom movement.
हमारे राष्ट्रकवि मुंशीलाल दुखैल थे, जो गांव-गांव में जाकर देशभक्ति का संचार करते थे, गीतों द्वारा स्वतंत्रता प्राप्ति के लिए लोगों को जागृत करते थे। न रोक मुझी रानी न रोक, देश पुकारे थो, राह निहारे थो, तू न बुद्धि थी शाहू जग जा बाजा, बुध चवन साथा, न रोक मुझी रानी न रोक। एक नौजवान अपनी पत्नी से कहता है, मुझे मत रोको, मैं देश के आज़ादी के आंदोलन के सर्वस्व अर्पण करने के लिए तैयार हूँ। तो ऐसी भावना जागृत कर रहे थे।
47ની રાત્રે 12 વાગે આપણને આઝાદી મળી. એમાં પાછું સવારના એ હતો બધા સ્કૂલોમાં અને દરેક જણે સાંસ્કૃતિક પ્રોગ્રામ કર્યા હતા. તેની અંદર હું લોર્ડ માઉન્ટબેટન બની હતી અને 6 અંગ્રેજ હતા. અમે લોકોએ જે પ્રોગ્રામ આપ્યો હતો એની અંદર આ મેં લીધેલું અને એનું આખું ગાયન છે જે મારે ગાવાનું હતું. अब हम तो चले इंग्लैंड पहन कर पैंट लगा कर सेंट ये लंदन प्यारा भारत में कौन हमारा सोने की चिड़िया के खातिर हमने लाखों जाल बिछाए थे खुल गई पोल लुट गया नसीब हमारा अब भारत में कौन हमारा.
हमारे
So that's the last story that I have to share. And we try to get as many people to sing forgotten songs as we can. Most are shy, but sometimes we get really lucky. And honestly, I find that the voices sound haunting so many years later. Thank you so much. Before I end, I would like to say we run 3 projects. If you think you know someone who you think should be interviewed, reach out to me at info@citizensarchiveofindia.org. It sounds very fancy. I only check that email ID. It's not like I have someone sitting and checking it. So I'll see your email soon. We also run 2 more projects. Like I said, Delhi Ki Khirki in partnership with Ekta Chauhan, and a project called Soboykar in partnership with Jane Borges, who is the journalist of the Midday, who many of you, the name may be familiar, and her partner, Sheena Maria Piedad. That is the story of the Catholics of the west coast of India who migrated to Bombay and then sometimes even migrated abroad. So if you have anyone who can fit into these projects, get in touch with us. If you're thinking of conducting a project of your own neighborhood or locality or area or historical event, get in touch with us because we help independent oral historians store their projects. And of course, we work with your help. So if you think you'd like to donate, please do get in touch with me as well. That would be greatly appreciated. More than that, thank you so much for spending your Saturday evening with me. I have been super indulgent and included a lot of stories. So thank you for your patience. And I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Malvika. Those stories were really what made my Saturday evening, and I'm sure for everyone else as well. And I think that song was just the perfect note to end it in. So thank you very much for making sure you included the songs.
I'm glad. We loved it when we heard it. So it had 4 or 5 verses. I've cut it down.
It's really lovely. I think just hearing people speak and recap gives you, I mean, it gave me, your entire talk gave me goosepimples throughout, a bit of tears at, whatever was happening, but what a lovely evening. Thank you again. So I'm going to go through the questions, and also thank you for, first of all, apologies to everyone for starting late because of some technical glitches, and therefore it extended a little bit, but I don't think anybody has any regret for that. I'm going to go through the questions quickly for you. I think very early, there was a question from Nivi saying, how do you choose the participants for their memories? You did clarify in the end that you're asking people to come forward, but how do you go forward and choose?
So when we first started, it was all word of mouth. My first few interviewees were my own grandmother and my father's aunts, who I'm very lucky to have grown up in a very large joint family and have not one, but many, many grandmothers, and be the oldest grandchild. So they're quite willing to indulge me. And I use them as my guinea pigs, poor things. And I think one of them is actually on this talk. And Pushpa Bhatia, if she's still here. And this envelope, I will tell you, is from her collection. Her family, she lived in Karachi till she was 10. And you can see a letter written to her family business, says Mrs. Jeevan Das Company, Merchants, Karachi, India. And it was sent in July 1933. And so they really indulged me and let me practice the craft of taking oral histories. We started out just a little bit before India's 70th Independence Day. And Jane Borges, who is now a partner and does an oral history project with me, actually was the first person to interview me with Midday. And then the newspaper interviews really started pouring in, and that got us a lot of eyeballs. And I'm always grateful to so many journalists who covered us. And they got in touch with us. I mean, we've been very lucky. It's grown really organically from there. And now, of course, when we do exhibitions and things, we make sure that it's put in paper so that people know. But now we get featured and we get a lot of blind calls and emails. And actually, I should have addressed this because every time I do a talk, I get this question. It's a very good question. We never say no to anyone. There is a long backlog and queue of people we have to interview, but we never say no to anyone. We don't care who you are, where you grew up, so long as for this project, you were born before 15th August 1947. I will say now that that generation is truly very old. We have lost most of the people I spoke about today. We do want to start interviewing the generation born in the first maybe 20 years after independence as well, while their memories are still clear. So, we're hoping to start that soon. That's how we choose. We choose anyone that comes our way. My colleagues have sometimes very shamelessly even started to say, I thought this person looked elderly and was sitting behind me and telling an interesting story on an airplane. So I asked them, if they, we've used any way possible to get an interesting story. But we don't reject anybody.
I have to add that you're also very proactive on social media. I think I have shared a picture at some point in time and tagged you in, with my father-in-law's picture. And I know that you've come back and said, can you send us more? Yeah. So I think that's a really great thing to do as well.
Oh, that's great. I don't remember this, but that's really great.
Share
it with me again. Share it with me again. So, yeah.
So I mean, the point is that you're really very proactive, in responding to people who are writing in or tagging you, and I think that's a great way to reach out to a very large number of people.
I will say social media, I don't know anything about how the metrics and the algorithms and anything, but I actually love that because that involves, we're building this archive for it to be accessible. We can't have it open and free access. I wish it was so easy, and we started out with those ideals. It does have to be closed access, but we have yet to say no to someone who's requested access. And we've given access to all sorts. So there's Ramya Ramamurthy, who wrote a book on marketing history. So stories like that Gold Spot one. The Miss Marvel TV show that came out last year on Netflix used some of our stories. Salil Tripathi, the journalist and author, has used Mrs. Rama Khandwala's story. I don't know if he's on here, but if he is, hi Salil, and I look forward to reading about that. All kinds of things. And, there's a children's book written by Lubaina Bandukwala about the Quit India movement. They used it. So we're very happy to provide access, which is why we have to be responsive on social media. It also shows us how people are responding to the stories we're collecting, what it is that we're maybe missing out on. Like when I did the talk just now, Sukhi, I looked at, your reactions because I can't see anyone else's face. I said, I have to know so that I'm not boring. I'm not boring. So I have to change tack if I am. So
now I'm embarrassed about clearing my, wiping my tears in the middle, but yes.
I love hearing those reactions. And our first responsibility, I always say, is to our interviewees. And even though they're signing their life stories off to us, that's a huge responsibility. Our second responsibility is to our users, and we have to make sure we're catering to users.
Lovely. Dipinder Singh Kapani wants to know, he says, you've mentioned about Sindhi refugees wearing Multani clothes, and what were they like? And was it Pathani Salwar Kameez, because that came from frontier to rest of Pakistan much later in 70s?
Dipinder, that's a really great question because I actually wondered about that myself. Till last night, I was like, really? That seems odd. But I did find a few pictures, and I'm no expert on the Sindhi refugee situation. That is not my area of study. I happen to have taken this interview. When you're an oral historian, you do get a lot of memories. This lady, Mrs. Janurkar, her memories were exceptionally clear and factually accurate in most places. We also go back and check a lot for fact checking because memory is fluid. If someone 80 years from now asked you what happened then, you may remember what you read in a newspaper, but she very accurately remembered these. I did look, and I also saw most Sindhi Hindus actually women wearing saris. But I imagine they may have worn loose salwars. I really am not sure. It is something I am actually looking into myself as well. All I know is that her memories were exceptionally clear, and I do tend to believe her. So.
Great. Steven Pancholi asks that, he says, I know this may be a little divergent from the centrality of the topic, but I'll ask, can the digital seminar be called a text, which consists of a memory-based textuality, orality being orally textualized? And does it change the idea of space and the idea of a text?
I'm a little confused about this question. Give me a minute to read it again. Can this digital seminar be called a text, which consists of a memory-based textuality? I assume it means textually? Orality
Yeah, it's a
being
text rather
oral.
than oral.
As in, if you mean, is this the recording of something oral? Then I guess, yes. And this changes the ideas of both space of India and the idea of a text. I don't know that I would call it a text, but I feel like I might be misunderstanding your question. I'm sorry, but you can write to me if you'd like to clarify, and I'm happy to have a conversation about that.
So lots of people have, I think, yeah, this can be picked up because even I only understood as oral being oral and that's being recorded. A lot of people have complimented, and I'm not going to count every single person's name. Vinita Sridharani says that it might never have been Dr. Ambedkar's caste, but just the fact that he was a Brit returned lawyer in the thick of constitution work, and many didn't like that. So one might not know those angles. Of course, she goes on to say that he was their family's lawyer.
Wow, he was your family lawyer. That is amazing. And if you have anyone who has memories of him, please do get in touch with me. Yes, you might be right. In this case, again, I've really shortened a lot of these stories for the purposes of time. But she seemed very clear that this was about caste. So
I think you went on to talk about the dowry death, and she says that there are also horrific stories of violence from partition that we've heard from our families, relatives, and I think that's true for most of us who, you know, who from North and who had family travel, sort of come over from Pakistan.
yes, so whether it's the partition, people have spoken about other riots that have taken place as well. People have spoken about social issues like this dowry death. This is the one case actually we have of dowry death described so vividly, and the lady spoke about it because she actually went on to be a social worker and deal with these issues, so she spoke about it quite openly. It is, no matter what the situation, and I've been doing this for 6 years, it never doesn't make your heart stop. It never doesn't leave you shocked. And you know, when we get out of the person's house and onto the train or into the cab or into the car, however we're going home, we kind of make it a point to stop somewhere for lunch and talk about something else, because the job can become very heavy. So yes, it is always sad, 6 years of stories like this, and it never stops being horrifying.
I'm glad you said that, because that was going to be my question as to how do you deal with hearing these stories. Some of them are great and they're uplifting, but the others can really be.
Yeah, I will say most of them are uplifting. Even those who've been through, you know, an event like the partition or the riots, and things like that. 99% of their story is still the good things. And you do take the good with the bad. These are stories in isolation. When I say interviews, it's not like we go to their house for an hour and interview them and that's it. We've done people 7, 8 sessions. With Joseph Cunha, we did 7 sessions of over an hour each. One of my uncles actually gave me 15 sessions of interviews. So it's a really, really long process. These stories have been culled out of hundreds of hours of interviews. But we do switch off. You really do have to switch off. And, you know, there's the partition historian, Achal Malhotra, is a friend, and she and I talk about this all the time. And she's written 3 lovely books based on the, you know, on the partition, but they're very heavy. And I said, and when it first came out of this book, I said, you know, I haven't read the whole thing because I can't come home from work and then read about oral histories of the partition, even though the partition is not what I'm dealing with. And she said, I get it, Malvika. If you'd written a book, I don't think I'd have been able to read the whole thing one shot either. It's too much. It's like working all the time. You gotta come home and watch bad Netflix or something. You can't, it's, you know, when you're a historian, you have a lot of friends who write books and coming home and reading them. While you're supportive, it still feels like work. So I have a shelf full of books that I've read very slowly and in parts. So yeah.
Vijay says that he's 51 years old and the session has taken him to nostalgia. Anil has thanked you for the wonderful service that you're doing. Dr. Harihar Murthy from Bangalore says, thank you for, and he thanks Arun Bhatia for giving him a heads up of your program, very well compiled stories. Preeti thanks you as well, as does Meeta and Akshita and Shrikant and Siddhi. And Stephen Pincholi says that this has been an extremely brilliant project and great talk, as does Julia. And Harihara gives thumbs up for the House and Marine Drive. Stephen also wants to know about the archive, since he or she is researching on a similar line, and let me know about the means to contact you, but I think you've already provided your
That's
contact
on the
details.
screen shared.
Yeah.
Please do contact me.
Yeah. How do you think these memory-based archives change and relocate the idea of a certain space? Can you mention some implications of oral history?
I don't think these memory-based archives change and relocate the idea of certain space. Again, I think
Or
these-
at a certain space?
Okay. Well, again, like I said, it adds a lot of nuance, or you see a space. Like I said, here we're looking, I said that this is the oral history of India. This is a little wide. It's whatever I could include in. I was given 40 and I took 50 minutes. But it adds a lot of nuance to you. You go into something having a set idea of what that space might have been like. And then you talk to someone who really has experienced it at a certain point in history, and that hopefully adds enough nuance to change your perspective, because everyone goes in with a certain bias. And I say this whenever people ask me, say, oh, isn't oral history biased? And I always say, isn't written history biased? Because someone's written it. Right? It's not just been written in thin air. It's everyone's got some bias that creeps in. So yeah, I hope it adds enough nuance that it does change ideas of, what of certain spaces, certain times. Yeah.
Vijay has a question for you, saying that you mentioned that the organization is funded, and are there any commercial aspects to your work? And Hugo says that you may choose to not reply to the question.
That's very kind of you. No, it is a non-profit. But if someone wants to access material, there's a small administrative fee involved. So, but it's very small. It's like going to a library, unless you're doing it for commercial work and want large chunks of video and things like that. But it is a non-profit, and we do depend on donations.
A lot of people, again, Preeti has an interesting question, says, have you had contrary stories recounted, and how do you deal with that situation?
That's interesting. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. Have I heard contrary? Yeah. Gosh, it can get a little sensitive. We had a lot of people like Rama Khandwala talk about, Subhash Chandra Bose and her admiration of him. And then we had a person's wife, a person's widow, talk about how her husband was in the army, fought on the Burmese front, and actually didn't like some of the things, some of Bose's policies and some of the things he fought in the British Indian Army, and why he didn't like them. Again, I won't get into it here. How do you deal with it? Like I said, you leave your own bias at the door, and you embrace the fact that everyone has an opinion and everyone has perspective, and everyone experiences the same event in their own way. Everyone's experience is unique, which is what makes oral history important. So one person says one thing and one person says the other. That's not the same as forgetting a date. But it's interesting when two people experience the same event in a completely different way. For instance, the partition for Indians, the partition of our country was its partition. For Pakistanis, it was the birth of their nation. It's the same event, the same refugee crisis, the same horrors, which nobody denies there were horrors, there's homesickness. But it's a different way to think about it, right? So
okay, this is the last question. Vijay wants to know if the stories narrated by historians are being validated with some proof.
Vijay, that's a great question. In fact, it's oddly the opposite to the previous question, where the previous person asked if there are contrary situations. So yes, when we bring in a story, like I've said, we keep in mind that memory is fluid. And when someone says something, we do extensive, research on what they've said. If something sounds like that may not be too accurate. Usually what happens, we find, is that people are mixing it up with another event, because most of the people we interview are really old. And but also oral history interviews, it's not like we've taken one interview in isolation, we've taken hundreds. So they feed off each other. So let me give you an example. For example, we had someone talk about someone who grew up in a village in Saurashtra, talk about an earthquake that took place over there. Now, we could find no evidence of this earthquake because they said the year and everything. And we usually, or they may not have said the year, we try to look for the year because that's how we keyword it in the catalog. So someone comes looking for that event, they can find it easily. And we couldn't find it anywhere. We said, now, did this happen? Did this not? Were they a 5-year-old then? And that's why they're thinking of it like that. A few interviews later, we interviewed someone who we realized was from, just a few villages away. And then we asked them, we said, did you remember there was some earthquake around this time? And they said, yes, it was there. I remember it. And they remembered it. And those two actually, given that we had 2 people who clearly remembered this, that confirmed the event. And that gave us more details to actually run the search again and find it. Similarly, in the lockdown, for those from Bombay, you remember we had a cyclone and the newspapers had all put first cyclone and all of that. And my colleague called me, said, no, it's not the first. What are they saying? So I said, what? So remember we took that interview and someone said 1948, there was a cyclone. And we went back to the interview and we posted on social media saying, hey, the papers are wrong. And then we looked it up. And in the Sydney Morning Herald from 1948, we found, yes, cyclone has hit Bombay. And then a day later, actually, all the newspapers, all our local newspapers also kind of redacted and said, yes, there was a cyclone before. Yesterday, we said this wasn't, but there was one before. And my colleague called me, she said, I really feel validated. Now we got... So it's honestly, it feels really great when something like that happens. It makes you realize how important your work is, even if it's such a small, minor thing that happened in history. And again, my uncle Arun Bhatia was one more of my interview guinea pigs who somebody mentioned over here. And I think he's on this call. He had also then at that time, I think, texted me saying, yes, I recall this cyclone. And his memory is sharper than anyone's I know. He's, like I said, he's 15 sessions of interviews. He's had songs and everything. And I was very tempted to include one. I knew it was getting too long. So yeah. He's got an outstanding memory and he's written columns. He lives in Bangalore. He's written columns for as long as I remember. So sometimes if I really can't find, I do even call him and say, do you remember? And he'll remember.
Thank you. That's great. I really feel that the work that you're doing is really like putting little pieces of a jigsaw puzzle together. And the more the pieces fit in, the better the view. And, obviously it's an ideal situation where you have a story from everyone. So you knew a particular moment in time. But, the closer you get, the nicer the image or a more clearer an image that comes out. So thank you very much for this great work that you're doing. Thank you for being, sort of so approachable. And I hope that many, many more people come with their stories to you and you get the funding that you need and the stories can sort of stay with us forever. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely evening. See you next week.
Thank you to everyone. Thank you for the lovely compliments and thank you, Khaki, for having me.